Border smugglers. The cartel system began with a simple problem. Drugs had to cross the U.S. Mexico border, and someone had to move them. For much of the 20th century, that job belonged to smugglers rather than cartels. Small trafficking groups operated along the border, moving marijuana and heroin north into the United States. Many of them came from rural regions in western Mexico, especially the mountainous areas of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, where drug crops were already being cultivated. The operations were not large empires yet. A typical network looked simple on the surface. Growers produced the drugs. Drivers moved them across the border. Middlemen handled distribution once the shipments reached U.S. cities. The people organizing these routes relied heavily on family ties and trusted partners, which made infiltration difficult for authorities. As the 1960s and 1970s passed, demand for drugs in the United States kept rising. Smugglers adapted quickly. Vehicles were modified with hidden compartments. Couriers carried packages across remote desert crossings. Corrupt officials at checkpoints could be paid to look the other way. Each successful run strengthened the network. Law enforcement often focused on seizing drugs or arresting drivers. Those losses were absorbed as part of the business. The routes themselves stayed active, and new smugglers stepped in when others were caught. The cocaine boom. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, cocaine production expanded rapidly in Colombia. Cartels such as Medellin and Cali were shipping large quantities toward the United States, which had become the most profitable market for the drug. The challenge was geography. Moving cocaine directly into the U.S. became harder as American law enforcement tightened controls across the Caribbean routes. That pressure forced traffickers to adapt. Colombian organizations began pushing shipments through Central America and into Mexico. Mexican smugglers already knew the border. They understood the highways, the desert crossings, the checkpoints, and the officials who could be bribed to look the other way. At first, they served as transporters. Their job was simple: move the product north. Then, the payment model changed. Instead of cash, Colombian suppliers started paying Mexican traffickers with a portion of the cocaine itself. A shipment might pass through Mexico, and the people moving it would keep a share of the load as payment. That shift transformed the business overnight. Mexican traffickers were no longer just couriers moving someone else's product. They suddenly had inventory they could sell themselves inside the United States. Profit margins multiplied. Control over routes became far more valuable. Groups that once handled transportation started building their own distribution networks across the border. By the mid-1980s, the scale of trafficking had grown dramatically. Larger shipments moved through Mexico. New alliances formed between traffickers and corrupt officials who could protect the routes. The border pipeline kept expanding, and the people running those routes realized something. They didn't need the Colombians anymore. Birth of the cartels. By the early 1980s, trafficking through Mexico had grown into a steady pipeline. You see, cocaine, marijuana, and heroin moved north through networks that stretched from rural production zones to border crossings and U.S. cities. Drivers transported shipments. Couriers carried smaller loads. Corrupt officials protected certain routes. The system relied on trust and quiet coordination. At the center of that system sat one organization, the Guadalajara Network. During the mid-1980s, traffickers such as Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero helped coordinate smuggling routes across large parts of Mexico. Instead of many isolated groups competing blindly, traffickers began organizing territories known as plazas. Each plaza controlled access to a key corridor leading toward the United States. The arrangement brought order to a chaotic trade. Local operators moved shipments through their assigned territories and paid a share to those managing the network above them. The structure created a system that could move drugs across the country with far fewer internal conflicts. Then, the pressure arrived. In 1985, the kidnapping and murder of U.S. DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena triggered a massive investigation. Mexican and American authorities targeted the Guadalajara leadership and dismantled much of the organization during the late 1980s. The structure collapsed. The roots did not. Instead, the old network split apart. Former lieutenants took control of different plazas. New groups emerged to defend those territories. Competition spread across the trafficking corridors that connected Mexico to the United States, and the system that had once been coordinated from one center began multiplying into rival cartels, the cartel business empire. By the 1990s and early 2000s, trafficking routes across Mexico had become some of the most profitable corridors in organized crime. Cocaine shipments from South America moved north. Marijuana and heroin produced inside Mexico joined the flow. Later, synthetic drugs such as methamphetamine and fentanyl began moving through the same pipelines. The logistics were already in place. Smuggling routes stretched across deserts, ports, highways, and border crossings. The organizations controlling those routes started realizing something important. Every shipment moving through their territory created an opportunity to charge a fee. Groups began taxing other traffickers who wanted to move drugs through their plazas. Smugglers paid for protection, access to routes, and safe passage across certain territories. That system turned the cartels into gatekeepers of the entire pipeline. Once the revenue started expanding, the business model grew wider. Kidnapping rings appeared in territories controlled by cartel groups. Migrants traveling north through Mexico were forced to pay for safe passage or risk abduction. Fuel theft from government pipelines became another profitable operation, especially in states where cartel influence was strong. Extortion spread into construction companies, agriculture, and local businesses. These activities used the same networks already built for drug trafficking. Armed enforcers protected the operations. Local contacts handled information and corruption. Money moved through front businesses designed to hide profits inside the legal economy. The organizations began operating less like smuggling groups and more like diversified criminal enterprises. And every new revenue stream made the system harder to dismantle inside the cartel machine. As the trafficking economy expanded during the 1990s, moving drugs across Mexico required coordination. Shipments crossed thousands of miles of territory. Drivers had to reach border crossings on time. Lookouts monitored highways and checkpoints. Corrupt officials needed to be paid before shipments arrived. This level of movement forced traffickers to organize. Leadership formed around a central boss, often called the capo or patron, who controlled major decisions and alliances. Beneath that position were regional commanders responsible for specific plazas. Each plaza controlled a corridor, highways, border cities, or coastal ports used for trafficking. Under those commanders operated smaller layers of specialists. Logistics operators handled transportation and storage. Financial managers moved profits through businesses and laundering networks. Recruiters brought in drivers, lookouts, and street-level operators. Armed enforcement groups protected shipments, guarded territories, and eliminated rivals when disputes escalated. Communication networks tied the system together. Radios, encrypted phones, and trusted couriers carried instructions between regions. Information moved quickly because delays could expose shipments to law enforcement or rival groups. Each layer handled its own tasks while protecting the identities of people higher in the chain. Drivers rarely knew who owned the shipment. Street operators often never met the leadership. The structure limited damage when arrests happened. Authorities could capture individuals inside the network, but the system itself kept running. The faces of power. As the trafficking networks expanded through the 1990s and early 2000s, certain figures inside the organizations gained enormous influence. Some leaders managed entire corridors that moved drugs across Mexico and into the United States. Their decisions determined which routes stayed open, which groups worked together, and which rivals were pushed out. Several of those figures became widely known. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman rose through the Sinaloa trafficking network and later led one of the most powerful organizations in Mexico. Other leaders, such as Ociel Cardenas Guillen of the Gulf Cartel, controlled key border territories. Their organizations handled shipments worth billions of dollars each year. Public attention often focused on these individuals. Arrests, escapes, and manhunts turned them into headlines across Mexico and the United States. Governments targeted the leaders because removing the boss looked like the fastest way to weaken the organization. Inside the cartels, the system operated differently. Leadership rarely depended on one person alone. Trusted lieutenants managed plazas. Family members or longtime partners oversaw financial operations and logistics. Armed wings enforced discipline and protected the territory. When authorities captured or killed one leader, another figure often stepped into the position. Over time, this pattern repeated again and again. New leaders stepped forward, new factions formed, and the same routes stayed in play. Soon those routes stopped being business opportunities. They became battlefields. Violence and reputation, border crossings, highways, and ports could generate enormous profits. Losing one corridor meant losing millions of dollars in shipments. That pressure pushed organizations to defend their territory aggressively. Violence quickly became a tool for enforcement. Armed wings inside the cartels carried out attacks against rival traffickers, informants, and anyone suspected of interfering with operations. Some groups recruited former soldiers and police officers who already had training with military weapons and tactics. These enforcement units guarded shipments, protected leaders, and carried out retaliation when conflicts escalated. Conflicts between organizations intensified during the 2000s. The fragmentation of older trafficking networks created dozens of competing groups across the country. Battles for plazas erupted in cities along the U.S. border and in strategic interior states that controlled access to major highways. Shootouts, ambushes, and assassinations became more common as each group tried to dominate the same profitable corridors. Violence also served another purpose. Public displays of brutality spread fear among rivals and communities living inside cartel territory. Messages were often sent through threats, intimidation, or targeted killings meant to warn others about the consequences of betrayal or cooperation with authorities. These actions built reputations that traveled far beyond one city. In the cartel world, reputation could decide whether rivals challenged a territory or avoided it entirely. Fear became a form of protection, and reputation became a weapon. The money network. By the time shipments reach the United States, the drugs have already passed through several hands. The cash that comes back follows the same routes in reverse. Millions of dollars can move through a single trafficking corridor in a matter of weeks. That money cannot remain in bundles forever. It has to disappear into the legal economy. This is where the financial side side of cartel operations becomes critical. Trafficking organizations use networks of businesses to hide profits. Cash is broken into smaller deposits and moved through banks to avoid detection. Front companies appear in industries where large cash flow attracts little attention: construction firms, restaurants, transportation services, and import-export businesses. Each transaction helps convert illegal profits into funds that appear legitimate. Some operations rely on international laundering systems. Money brokers move funds across borders through trade-based laundering, using shipments of goods to disguise financial transfers. Products may be deliberately overvalued or undervalued on invoices, so money can quietly cross international banking systems. The transactions look like ordinary commerce. Corruption often plays a role as well. Officials who receive bribes can delay investigations, ignore suspicious financial activity, or warn organizations about enforcement actions. These protections help keep the financial networks functioning, while law enforcement focuses on seizures of drugs or weapons. Even when authorities intercept shipments, the financial structure often remains intact. The profits from earlier deliveries have already been distributed through layers of accounts, businesses, and brokers. And once the money disappears into the system, the trail rarely leads back.